Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Keel, and today I'm going to be talking about what standards-based grading actually looks like in my classroom and how I implemented it. So, education is famous for providing us with great theory. For me, the standards-based grading journey all started when I read the book Grading Smarter, Not Harder by Myron Dweck, and I was able to attend a few of his in-person conferences, and I completely agreed and bought into the philosophy of standards-based grading. I followed it up with some more reading and articles, and it was something that my school worked on together. And so hopefully you're here today because you've done the same thing. You've read about the theory and you're here because you want to know, well, I'm in. I buy this theory, but what does it actually look like in a middle school language arts classroom? How do I actually implement it? And so that's what I'm here to talk about today. I'm not here to convince you that standards-based grading is the way to go. Hopefully you're here because you're already there and just want more of that practical application piece. For me, some practical reasons why standards-based grading makes sense. I like reporting on how a student is doing as a reader or a writer as a proficiency level versus giving them a grade on an assignment. I think that when you're reporting on just the priority standards, it really forces you to put into the grade what is important that students are actually knowing. I also like being able to report out success skills separately. I think it's important for students and for parents to know, is my student responsible? Is my student respectful of others? But that's not necessarily something that should be incorporated into their middle school language arts grade. So reporting out on those things separately makes a lot of sense to me. And then I also just think it makes what I need to teach and what students need to learn extremely clear. So where do you start? If you want to go on this journey, where do you actually begin? You have to start by reading your state standards for the grade level and the content that you teach. So for me, I read the Wisconsin Middle School Language Arts Standards. And from there, you need to select which standards you would like to make into your priority standards. And I'll talk more specifically about that. Next, once you have the priority standards picked out, you would put your selected standards into parent-friendly and student-friendly language while also maintaining the meaning of the standard. Once again, I'll show you an example of this, but I think this part is so important that you don't just take the exact wording of the standard and think that students are going to understand it and parents are going to understand it. It should be something that is concise, something that's understandable. And then if possible, I know this isn't always possible, I really do believe this should be, if you're in a middle school, like my middle school is grades 5 through 8, this should be a 5-8 process that you're doing together, that you are working with, for sure, with your grade level team that you're on the same page with, because that's the way the system is going to improve. I understand that that's not always how it can be. If you're committed to going this route and nobody else in your school or on your team is, you're very brave for trying it out. And maybe once you try it out, you'll get more people to come along with you on the journey. So let's talk priority standards. You might have heard them called essential standards, power standards. There's probably like 5 other words for them. In the Common Core state standards for language arts in middle school at any given grade level, there are 42 standards that we're supposed to teach. So how do we know which one of these standards are the most important for students to learn and become proficient in? So the actual breakdown of that, there's 10 reading literature standards, 10 informational, 10 writing, 10 or 6 speaking and listening, and 6 language. So the standards you select as your priority standards, those are the standards that you are going to formatively and summatively assess and report out on. It doesn't mean that you're not going to teach to the other standards, just means that you're picking the standards that you are actually going to be reporting in your standards-based grading method. So I'm just going to give you an example of the priority standards that my grade 6 team selected. So we decided to select 6 reading standards. What we did is we actually combined the literature and the informational standards together, and we made them just reading standards. That took away a lot of standards, and then also allowed us to report whether we were doing a nonfiction reading unit or a literature-based reading unit. We are able to report out on those priority standards and come back to those key ideas. We selected 7 writing and language standards. We decided to kind of combine writing and language together. We thought those went nicely together. And then we selected 1 speaking and listening standard for a total of 14 priority standards that we report out on. If you're reading the theory-based books, they'll probably tell you that might be a few too many priority standards. Maybe some books would say that's not enough. But for us, this is what we have tried, and we've done this for 2 years now, and we think it works pretty well. And once again, now I'm going to show you how that actually looks in the day-to-day. So once you've selected your priority standards and put them into that student-friendly and parent-friendly language, another thing that you need to decide is what type of proficiency scale you're going to use. So I've seen a 4-point scale, like a 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I've seen a 3-point scale with a 2, 1, 0. We personally settled on the 3, 2, 1, 0 scale, with 3 being mastery of standard, 2 partial mastery of standard, 1 minimal mastery, and 0 is a lack of evidence. So this is what we personally decided on. I'm not saying this is the right way. I can tell you that we chose it because we didn't want the 4, 3, 2, 1. We felt that equated too directly with A, B, C, D, F, and that parents would just see it that way. And then we had a hard time doing just the 2, 1, 0. We just couldn't get quite that black and white of if they got it or they didn't. So we settled on the 3, 2, 1, 0. Whatever proficiency scale you decide, you need to come to some common understandings of what proficiency means at those different levels. And the best way that I found to do this is to actually use student examples and come together with your teams and have people discuss where they would put things on the proficiency and why, and have some great conversations around that. Also, proficiency rubrics are key and will really help you define proficiency as well, and I'll show some examples of those later. So some of the first work that we did, this is an activity that I led with the language arts team. I'm the literacy coach at my school. Work with your team to define proficiency. So we actually took some anchor chart paper, gave some anchor chart markers, and we just went around and we wrote down, what do we think a 3 means? What do we think a 2 means? A 1, a 0? And then we had conversation around that and tried to come to some common understanding about it. And that was a very helpful and simple and easy to do activity. I would highly recommend doing this if you're doing it with a team of teachers. So I made this big and yellow and bold because your work does not stop here. I've seen and worked with different school districts where, this is a lot of work, taking the standards, picking out your priority standards, putting them into that student friendly language, choosing your proficiency scale, defining proficiency. And you think, we did it, we're done, we can implement standards based grading now. That's where the problem lies, is that's not where you stop. You've now just begun. You've now had the common understandings that are going to bring you into the real day-to-day work. So now your daily curriculum and your assessment plan have to match what you've decided. So your daily curriculum and assessment plan, for me, I've tried several different ways of teaching middle school and how to structure my class period, how to structure units, how to change between reading and writing. And for me, I'm a huge fan of reading units and writing units. The reason why, they're easy to scope and sequence across the year and across grade levels. You can plan which priority standards you will formatively and summatively assess in each unit. For reading units especially, and writing units, you want to make sure that your priority standards you select are things that are going to apply again and again and again to your units. They should have that spiral where students are going to be able to come back to that priority standard through a different lens, through a different text, through a different type of writing, again and again and again. So if you're looking from like big to small, you need to have a scope and sequence. And then if you get a little smaller, you need to have a detailed unit plan for each part of your scope and sequence. And you also need to have a daily teaching framework. So let's take a look at what these things could look like. Because once again, I don't just want to give you the theory, I want to show you this is what it could look like. So here are some sample scope and sequences for the school year. I'm going to bring this up for you. Might just take a second. So I realize that some of you here might just be reading teachers or might just be writing teachers, or maybe you're like me where you teach language arts where you're responsible for reading, writing, language, speaking and listening, all of it, all the things. So for the people who are responsible for teaching just reading, this could be an example of what your year looks like with units. So you might start with some type of a kickoff and then do a realistic fiction reading unit, narrative nonfiction, a science fiction. So whatever that looks like across the 9 months of the school year, you could sequence out your units that way, where you're kind of going between fiction-based and nonfiction-based units. If you are a teacher like me, where you have to teach reading and writing and you have less than 90 minutes, I think it's extremely hard to teach reading and writing both in a given class period. So what has worked the best for me is going between reading and writing units. So this is what a scope and sequence would look like for my year. I'd start with a reading unit, be realistic fiction, and then the next unit I would go to would be a persuasive writing unit. I'd hop back into a reading unit, a writing unit, and go back and forth. If you are a teacher that has over 90 minutes to teach, there is a great possibility that you could teach reading and writing both every day. So maybe you would be in a reading unit and a writing unit every day, or maybe you're in a middle school where there's a reading teacher and a writing teacher. So maybe you could work together to have reading and writing units that go together across the year. So here are just a few examples of what a year could look like with a scope and sequence of reading and writing units. I'm going to link this presentation into my blog post. So if you want to come back to the presentation and actually take a more detailed look at any of the documents I'm showing you, make sure you go back and do that. So next up, I want to show you a sample unit plan. So now you have the scope and sequence. So now that next level is, okay, what does an actual unit look like? So unit plan should include a formative assessment and a summative assessment plan. And you should aim to assess every priority standard for reading at least one time formatively and one time summatively in every unit. And the same goes for writing, but the unit plan that I'm going to show you is a reading unit plan. So this sample reading unit plan is for a realistic fiction reading unit. And as you can see, this would be the total plan for the whole unit. So what do you teach on day 1 all the way to what would you teach on day 20 of the unit? And a couple things that I want to point out to you in this unit plan. First thing would just be that the mini lesson statements are aligned to a standard. So, and not just any standard, they're aligned to a priority standard. The other piece is that I have little asterisks and it says summative assessment. So for instance, mini lesson sequence 5, I know that this mini lesson is something that's going to show back up on the summative assessment. I think it's really important if you're going to put something on a summative assessment that you are doing a formative assessment with that mini lesson along the way. So, like I said, at the very least, I want to do a formative assessment on anything that I'm going to do a summative assessment on. But I also might do more formative assessment along the way than just 6 times. So for us, we have 6 reading priority standards. So in my unit plan, I have accounted for the 6 priority standards that are going to be on the summative assessment. I know I'm going to do a formative assessment on those, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to do a formative assessment on some of the others as well. And we've also factored in of when the summative assessment is going to happen. So this is something that we would come together as a team, decide what data are we going to teach each mini lesson. You know, if we're doing a read aloud with it, what pages in our read aloud are we going to use? Our unit plans are very specific. They account for the day-to-day teaching. So there's an example of that. And then the next thing I want to show you is, okay, so now the next level down would be what is the daily teaching framework that you're using? So we've got the big scope and sequence, and then we have the unit plan. So now what are we doing on a daily basis to teach that unit plan? So daily, what does your daily structure look like? And for us, this is what it looks like. It takes into account that gradual release of responsibility. It has different instructional methods that we really believe in and have seen students show success with. So that is the example of that. So then the next piece I want to talk about is, what does assessment for standards-based grading actually look like? So a couple examples of formative assessment. I'm going to show an example of an exit ticket, but there are so many different ways that you could have students do formative assessment. Could have them do a short answer response, a reading response paragraph, an exit ticket, as I mentioned. Could have a teacher student interview where it's just a discussion between you and the student and you're assessing them. Could use a Google form. I love multiple choice with an explanation of your chosen answer to give a little bit deeper understanding of why they chose the answer they did. A small group discussion, screencastify with the Google Slides presentation like I'm doing now that students could make and present and turn in. There's also some really great things out there for digital spoken response, such as Screencastify, Flipgrid. Using voice notes on Google is really easy and could easily use that with Google Classroom. So lots of different ways that you could do the formative assessment. And once again, like when you're doing that unit plan, it's great to decide, okay, which mini lessons are we going to do a formative assessment on? Which method are we going to use to do those formative assessments? For the summative assessment, this is something that is, for me, completed at the end of the unit. It should assess your priority standards that you've also formatively assessed throughout the unit. And then it shouldn't be brand new. It shouldn't be like, okay, we're going to try this whole new way of doing all these different types of priority standard assessments. Like it should be something where it should be how you formatively assessed it, or it should be a method that students are extremely comfortable and familiar with. So with formative assessments and summative assessments, proficiency rubrics are huge. So for proficiency rubrics, you are going to start with the learning target or the mini lesson statement, which go hand, they're the same, being commonly assessed. And your mini lesson statement must be aligned to a priority standard. You're going to examine the assessment method that you use. So what are you asking students to do? And then in your team, you would design the proficiency rubric. You want to make your proficiency rubric specific to what you are asking students to do on this assessment. I have not had great luck with having a general rubric relating to a priority standard as a whole. I just don't think it makes it easy to grade. It makes it hard across the grade level team to calibrate how we're grading, and then it makes feedback to students more difficult as well. So if you are making a proficiency rubric specific to the assessment that you're doing, it definitely makes that calibration and feedback much better. And then also, I've seen it where teachers try to like revert back to old school grading and try to say it's, try to give like, if you get this assignment is worth this many points and here are the different points for the pieces, and if you get this many points it means you're proficient. Like that's totally not standards based grading. So you want to make sure you're actually defining proficiency. So let's take a look at an example in action. So the example that I'm using would be the priority standard I'm reporting on. Reading standard 4, interpret words and phrases as they are used in a text. So when I go into my grade book, that is the standard that I'm going to report on each student's proficiency level for. The mini lesson statement that I am using to assess that priority standard within the unit, readers recognize examples of figurative language so they can consider the impact the figurative language has on how the reader interprets something in a book. I'm just gonna stop here for a second too. So I think a lot of people get so stuck on the priority standards and they just do the same thing again and again and again. There's so many, if you pick the right priority standards, there's so many different mini lessons that could go with each priority standard. So make sure you get creative and have mini lessons that go back to that umbrella priority standard, but that explore lots of different ways with books. So they're just showing that this mini lesson statement goes with this priority standard. So here's an example of an exit ticket that I use to assess that priority standard and that mini lesson statement. So it's about figurative language. So I'm just going to ask students to find 2 sentences in their realistic fiction book that contain figurative language. Make sure they're using proper text citation to cite the sentence, identify the type of figurative language, and explain how the figurative language helps you better understand a character, setting, emotion, or idea. So that's the formative assessment that I would ask students to do. And then here's the proficiency rubric. So to meet proficiency, students would have to identify 2 sentences that contain figurative language, cite the sentences the figurative language are used in with the proper text citation, correctly identify the type of figurative language cited, and thoroughly explain how the figurative language helps them understand a character, setting, emotion, or idea better. And then as you look down, what does approaches look like? What does minimal proficiency look like? And what does it mean to show no evidence? So defining the levels of proficiency for that specific assignment. One thing I really like to do for my students is to also show them what proficiency looks like. So here's an example of the exit ticket that I just showed you, where I would actually take a book that they're familiar with and show them this is what proficiency would look like for this assessment. So show them how to properly cite the textual evidence and the different figurative language that I picked out and how it helps me understand a character, setting, emotion, or idea better. I think it's great to just show students this is proficiency. You should aim for this or higher. All right. So we took a look at proficiency and proficiency rubrics. So now I want to talk about standards-based grading and how it is so perfect for if you're looking to use that PLC discussion format with your grade level teams. So the 4 PLC questions of what do we expect our students to learn? That's your unit plan. How will we know they are learning? There's your formative and summative assessments. And these last 2 questions, I feel like are questions that are the 2 most important questions that we should be talking about with our teams that we never get the chance to talk about because we're always working on all of that other stuff. We're always working on what are we doing? What does the lesson look like? What does the assessment look like? What does the proficiency rubric look like? We're always working on that. And we never get time to talk about these last 2 questions. So, how will we respond when they don't learn? So, this is the intervention question. And I think in my school at least, before we went to standards-based grading, this always fell back to like our universal screener, which we use STAR assessment if you're familiar with that. We're actually shifting over this year to FastBridge, but that's a universal screener. That's not what's how students are performing day to day. That's a one-time, one-piece assessment, and we put so much into that and automatically put students into intervention based on 1 score or based just on their state test score. And I really think we need to be looking more at how are students performing on the formative and summative assessments? Are they, it should be those students that are performing at minimal proficiency, those are your intervention students, and we should know the priority standards that they're weak on. That's the information that standards-based grading gives us that traditional grading won't. And then how will we respond if they already know it? That's that gifted piece, that's the extension. And once again, standards-based grading for those kids that are meeting that proficiency level and exceeding it every single time, these are great conversations that we can have with our teammates. So I realized that I threw a lot out there at you today, and I just want to tell you that this has been years of work to get here. And if you want to jumpstart and you're sitting here thinking like, I've read over my standards and I know them, but we haven't even picked our priority standards yet, or we don't even have a scope and sequence, or we don't have units, we don't have proficiency rubrics. I just want to tell you that I do have reading units and writing units that take all of these pieces into account. They literally have everything you could think of. They have proficiency rubrics, they have the unit plans, they have the daily lessons, they have the formative assessments. everything that you can think of, as well as really great professional development with directions of how to use it. So if you're thinking like you individually want to start this journey, or maybe it's my team wants to start this journey, my grade level team wants to start this journey, or my school wants to start this journey, these would be a great place to start if you're feeling like we don't have the time to put in all this work to get there, but we want to do this. And you know what? If you take these units, you are going to be able to jump into being a true PLC team and asking those 4 questions and doing the important work that's going to impact student learning. So I just want to show you really quickly the writing units that I have available. So the writing units that I have available are focused towards grades 6 through 8. There's 10 units in total. So there is a blog post unit, and each unit is designed to last about 3 weeks. There is a book recommendation unit, an Ask Anything, which is a research unit, a deleted scene, super fun narrative writing unit, an important issue letter, which is a persuasive writing unit, and then there's also a literary analysis, which is focuses in on that informative explanatory writing, memoir vignettes, another narrative nonfiction, which is a narrative unit, product review, which is a persuasive, and then quote to live by, which is an informative and explanatory. So if you are just a writing teacher, these 10 units could be your year-long curriculum. If you are like me, where you're a language arts teacher, maybe there's a couple of units in here that can make up your curriculum where you would choose, one persuasive, one informative explanatory, the research, and one narrative. I also have reading units, and this has been my baby this summer. I mean, these are like insane. These reading units are like hundreds of pages long, and they are the most extensive resource I've ever done. So, this is the realistic fiction reading unit. And I also have the historical fiction reading unit done. Science fiction fantasy unit is coming out very shortly. And you can also see that I'm working on myth and fairy tale inspired fiction, expository nonfiction, which is going to be all short nonfiction articles, narrative nonfiction, which is going to be mostly focused on rich middle school narrative nonfiction picture books, and then memoir biography. I'm also planning a short story reading unit. So these are going to be done this year. And like I said, they have everything you could imagine in them. I wanted to show you, like, these are very new products. So there's not like a ton of reviews on these yet, but the people that have bought them, like, they love it. So make sure you go and check and read the reviews on what people thought about the reading units. And then last, if your team really does want to do this work and get into it, I also have this resource where I have a reading workshop mini lessons guide where I've taken each of the Common Core reading standards, and I've written out like, here are like 20 mini lessons you could use to teach each standard. And then I've shown you the process that you can go through to create your own reading unit plans. So this is a great option if your school district wants to do the work of creating your own year-long scope and sequence for fiction and nonfiction reading instruction. This would be a great resource to start with. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today as we talked about standards-based grading and learning. I hope that I showed you some practical applications for where you could go with this and what this could look like in your classroom if standards-based grading is a route that you want to go. So make sure you let me know if you have questions, and I hope you enjoyed and learned. Thanks so much for joining.